Hi guys, so today I'll be showing you how to draw this ice cream cone. This video was actually a request from someone, but I know a lot of people struggle with drawing white objects, so it seemed like a good one to show you. Alright, let's get into it. So the first thing to do is to get the bright whites down on the paper. Even though this is a white object, the vast majority of it isn't white. It's mostly made up of shadows. That said, there are a few bright white highlights in here, so we need to make sure that we get those down first. It just means that as you put down other colours on the paper, they don't take as easily. The white sort of stops that colour from going down as easily. Now you can see that I've barely put any white down here because there are only a few white highlights. So now I'm going to start at the lightest colour and work my way to the darkest. I'm using a reference photo to draw this ice cream, and the first thing I need to do is look really closely at that reference photo to see what colours are actually in there. So the first thing I'm going to pick out is this ivory colour. There is some very light yellow that I can see, particularly towards the left hand side. And I want that to go down as smoothly as possible on the paper, so I'm using tiny little circular motions and I'm pressing very lightly. Now let's move on to another light colour, which is this very light pink. Now you wouldn't think that pink would be in a white ice cream cone, but I can see it in the reference photo, so I will draw it. Depending on the lighting that you have on your white object, depends on the underlying colours that you can see in it. So it wouldn't necessarily be pink every time. So it's worth having a good look at the reference and seeing what is actually there. And by adding things like these odd little underlying colours, that's what gives the drawing more life and more realism, else it ends up looking a little bit dull. Now there's not a great deal of pink in here, and there is a lot more on the left of the picture. After that, I can move on to my very lightest grey, which is warm grey 1. I like to use lighter colours like this as a way of getting in the basis for my shading. By starting with a very light colour, it means that if I make any mistakes or if something's not looking quite right, it's very easy to correct it with a darker colour. Whereas if you went straight in with a dark colour and you made a mistake, it would be far harder to fix. So it's quite hard to see on camera because it's light colours on light paper, but you can sort of start to see the shape of the cone coming together already. On the most part, I'm using the pencil quite lightly, but on darker areas I am going a little bit firmer, just to start laying everything out. Now I've got the lightest grey down, I can move on to the second darkest grey, which is the warm grey 3. And I'm using this in a lot of places that I use the warm grey 1, but avoiding areas that are particularly light. This is a very interesting ice cream to draw because it's a whippy ice cream. There's loads of different shapes in here, so it's particularly good practice for shading. It's also always worth remembering that when you draw darker colours on, it's pushing an object back and the lighter areas are bringing it forward. It's worth having that in the back of your mind as you're drawing, whilst also looking at the reference photo, and I think it helps to make sense of what you're drawing. So now I'm moving on to the next darkest grey, which is the warm grey 4. And I'm just using this in more of the darker areas now. So I'm using a lot less of this grey than I did of the first grey. Now as I get towards the end of this grey, you can see that a lot of the shapes are marked out, but it's still looking a little bit dull, it's not looking right. So what I'm going to do is compare the drawing to the reference photo and work out which colours are missing. So the first colour I'm going to add into this now is going to be the Bister, so a light brown. I don't need to use a great deal of this colour, and it's mostly in the darker and more mid-tone values. When I'm using it on the mid-tone values, I'm putting a very light sort of glaze over the top, and then I'm being a little bit firmer in the areas that will become more shadowed. Now earlier when I said I could see some pinks in there, I'm just going to further add to that again, but with a slightly more earthy pink this time. I'm using the cinnamon. And now I'm going to start making my shadows a little bit deeper with the Van Dyke brown. The last colour I'm going to add to the ice cream for now is the dark sepia. And similar to the brown, I'm using this very sparingly. It's only going in areas of particularly deep shadow. So I'm going to leave the ice cream here for now and move on and draw the flake and the cone, and then I'm going to come back to the ice cream a little bit later. I find it far easier, particularly when drawing white objects, to get a base down and then draw the objects around it, and then it's far easier to see what you're missing on the white area. So I'm going to start with the flake, and I'm going to start by putting down a base of the ivory again. But this time I'm putting it over the whole area of the flake. I'm going to put down a light layer of the light pink again, and then I'm going to start with the bistre, marking out some of the ridges that are on the flake. Just like with the ice cream, I find it far easier to start marking things out with a lighter colour before going in with the deep colours. And you can kind of see the ridges being marked out and shaded. So now I'm moving on to the dark brown. I'm able to do this far more confidently because I've marked it out with the lighter brown. I'm working through the flake almost strip by strip and shading it on the sides so that each strip looks a little bit curved. But I don't need to worry too much about completely shading at this point because I'm going to work my way up to the darkest colour and then I'm going to work my way back down to the lightest. So I will be using this colour again in a second. So once I've got my general shading down for that colour, I'm going to move on to the dark sepia. And this is the colour I'm going to be using to get my darkest values in. I'm using this for pretty much every dip in the flake, although I am also using it around the bottom where the ice cream meets the flake. The only other colours I'm going to be using on the flake that I haven't used already is a Venetian red and a burnt ochre. Particularly around the top of the flake, where the light is coming through the flake, is making it look a little bit red. So I'm going to pop a little bit of that around the edge, and then I'm going to work back down through my colours and tweaking things as I go. I do find it easiest to work in this way, but one thing it does do is it does mute those darker colours. You can see as I'm putting other colours on top of the dark sepia, it is becoming far more muted, but we'll come back and fix that at the very end. Now I'm going to move on and draw the cone, and this is a relatively simple cone because it is a nice smooth cone. I'm starting this in a very similar way to how I started the flake, and I'm giving light coverage with the ivory pencil again. I'm also adding a little bit of cream on top of that, not all over, just in odd spots where again I can see some yellow in the reference photo. And then I'm going to move on to adding burnt ochre. On the most part, I'm adding a very light layer all over to begin with, and then I'm going back over a little bit deeper on the darker areas. There are some areas that I'm missing altogether with the burnt ochre where they're particularly light highlights. Now with the raw umber and then the Van Dyke brown, I'm going to start adding in some of the shading. Whilst I'm doing this, I'm still working in those circular motions that I was using right at the beginning. Because the cone is nice and smooth, I want to make sure that I replicate that in my style of drawing. Although I'm relatively happy with the shading on the cone, comparing it to the reference photo, I would say that it is missing some of the redder tones. So I'm going to use exactly the same red as I used earlier on the flake and just lightly glaze over the top of the areas where I need to add more red. Now that I'm generally happy with the cone, I'm going to work back down through those colours, and when I'm doing this it will become more vibrant. Now the last little bit I'm going to draw before I go back and do some more work on the ice cream is on this napkin. So in a similar way to earlier, I'm going to work through my 3 greys, building up some of the folds on this napkin, but there's actually not a huge amount on this. So now that I've got the flake and the cone drawn, I can go back and adjust the ice cream. Earlier I worked from the lightest to the darkest, now I'm going to work back down from the darkest to the lightest. Initially I'm particularly focusing on the greys, so I'm going to start with the warm grey 4 again. I'm particularly using this to make my shadows much darker than they are at the moment. I really want to make sure I have a decent amount of contrast in here. Don't be afraid of using greys because you think that the object you're drawing will no longer look white. If you don't have enough contrast in there, it won't look white, it'll look washed out. I'm going to keep moving down through these greys, increasing some of the mid-tones, and then I'm using the light grey a lot. I want to use this on most areas that aren't bright white because it'll help the bright white areas pop more. I'm just going to add a little bit more of the ivory in before I move on to the dark sepia again. This is the last thing I'm going to be doing, and I'm going to use it on all of my dark areas. Although I used it earlier, putting the other colours over the top of it did make it look much more muted, and I want the areas to be nice and dark. So I want to add this back in again so that it really pops. So I'm basically going to start at the top and work my way down the drawing. And this is my favourite bit, is where it all comes together. So, I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, give it a like, and don't forget to click the subscribe and the notify bell so you never miss an art tutorial. Happy drawing, guys. I'll see you in the next one.